Okay, today's lesson we're going to be talking about writing linear equations for our horizontal or vertical lines. These are graph lines that have a slope of 0 or undefined. So if you remember that Delta Math assignment you were working on last week, I had to input the equations when you got a slope of undefined, and I told you we would have a lesson over those equations. Well, today is that lesson. So today you are going to be writing an equation of a line that is parallel and perpendicular to either the x or y axis, and you're also going to be able to determine whether the slope is 0 or undefined. So here is a nice little memory jogger that you can write on any quiz or test paper to help you remember the characteristics of horizontal and vertical lines. So if you've got HOI VUX. So the first letter in HOI is going to tell you what the graph picture should look like. And H stands for horizontal, which means your graph line is going to be a flat line like the x-axis. Okay, so horizontal. And the second letter is going to help you remember the slope, because the slope of every horizontal line is 0. So that is really meant to represent a 0, not an O. And remember, if you have to calculate your slope, your 0 should be in the top, the numerator of your fraction. That's how you know that the slope is 0, which means your graph picture should show a horizontal line. Y, the third letter in HOI, is going to give you a clue about the equation that you have for that line. And the equation for every horizontal line or whose graph line has a slope of 0 is going to start off y equals, that's why it's a y, and then it's going to be a number. You will not see an x because, again, your slope tells you how many x's you have, and if you have 0 x's, you will not see that in the equation. It's going to be equal to an output value, because output, again, is another word for y. So there's your horizontal, okay? And now we're going to talk about VUX. So again, those three letters are going to clue you into the graph, what the slope should be, and how to start the equation. So V is going to clue you into that the graph line should be a vertical graph line, which means your line goes up and down. U is telling you that the slope of every vertical line is undefined. And if you have to actually solve for your slope or find it, and you're not looking at an equation, that 0 will be under the fraction bar, because under and undefined both start with U and D. The third letter, X, is going to clue you into the equation. So a vertical line equation starts off X equals, and that number at the end is going to come from the input value, because the input and X value are the same words. They refer to the same thing. So there is some information that you can use to connect your horizontal and vertical lines. So now we're going to kind of look at a comparison. So remember, we've got HOI and VUX are horizontal and vertical lines. We know that their horizontal has a slope of 0. Remember, the 0 is on top. So here's an example of what a horizontal would look like in the graph picture. And some also helpful information is that you may see that they may not say horizontal. They may not give you the slope of 0. They may not give you a graph picture where your line is flat and horizontal. They may say it's parallel to the x-axis, because remember, the x-axis is a horizontal graph line. So if you're parallel to that, you are also horizontal. Or they could give you the clue where it's perpendicular to the y-axis. So if you notice, your y-axis goes straight up and down, and a perpendicular line has to cross it, so that's going to make your graph line a horizontal graph line. So this is all information that could be given to you in a word problem or in a test or quiz question, and you have to be able to know that it's talking about a horizontal line. If you know your line is horizontal, then you know the slope. The slope is 0, and you know how to write the equation. It's a y equals an output value. For vertical line, again, it's vertical, so you may see that word. They may tell you you have an undefined slope, or give you 2 points, and when your x minus x part is 0, 0 under the fraction bar, you know you have a vertical graph line, which means you should see this. This is one example of a vertical graph line. Or they could tell you you're parallel to the y-axis, because remember, the y-axis is a vertical line. It goes up and down. Or you could be perpendicular to the x-axis. So if your line goes up and down, the x-axis is going to cross it. So all of this information could be told to you in a word problem or a quiz or a test question, and you have to be able to connect it back to a vertical graph line, which means you now know the slope is undefined, and you now know how to write the equation x equals the input value. So now let's look at some example problems so that we can start connecting all this information to how we could be asked. So for the first part, we are going to actually identify the slope. So remember, the slope for these equations, you have two choices. It's either going to be m equals 0 or m equals undefined, and I'm going to abbreviate undefined as UND just to shorten up our notes a little bit. So if we have a HOI line, a horizontal line, we know that our graph line is going to be flat line. We know our slope is 0, so m equals 0. And we know our equation is going to be y equals some number, and that number is going to be an output value. So if they give us an ordered pair, we know our output value. Just like if we have a vertical graph line, we have a VUX line. We know that the V is telling us our graph picture should show us a straight up and down line. Our slope is UND for undefined, and we know that our equation is going to be x equals a number, and that number is going to be an input value. So now let's look at our example problems. So I'm given this equation, and I have to be able to tell if it's a horizontal or vertical line so that I can identify the slope and give the intercept. And what I mean by intercept point is I'm either going to tell if that is an input or an output value. Okay, so I've got y equals a number. Y equals is a HOI, which means my graph line is horizontal, and I now know that the slope is 0. There's not really any work required if I can recognize that as a horizontal line. And now I want to tell, is this value, -5, is that an input or an output? Well, what's another word for y? If it's y equals, it's got to be the output. So that -5 is an output value. I don't know yet what my input value is, and at this point I'm not concerned with that. All I want to do is recognize my slope. I want to be able to connect it to what I should see in the graph, and then I want to see, is that an input or output value? All right, let's look at x equals 3. I see x equals, which tells me I have a VUX equation, which means my graph line is vertical. And I now know my slope without having to do really any math. It's undefined, which means there would be a 0 on the bottom of my fraction if I was actually solving for a fraction, solving for slope. And now I want to figure out, is this 3 that they've given me, is that an input or an output value? Well, if I know this is an x equals equation, x equals, this has to be an input, because input is another word for x. So this is 3 is going to go here, and I'm not concerned with my missing coordinate for my ordered pair because I'm not identifying that yet. All right, the next equation, x equals -5. Again, I see x equals, I don't see a y. Y is completely gone. That tells me it's a VUX, which again tells me that my graph line should be vertical. And I now know my slope without having to do any math. It is undefined because that is a slope of every vertical line, undefined. And now I should be able to tell you if this point, or this number really, is an input or an output value. Well, if it's x, another word for x is input, so this -5 is an input value. So it would go first in the ordered pair. And finally, my last equation. I see a y equals equation. There is no x, which means I have 0 x's. So that tells me it is a HOI line, which tells me that my graph line is going to be horizontal. And I know that the slope of every horizontal line is 0 because HOI, the second letter in HOI is O, which really stands for 0 to tell me my slope is 0. And now I can figure out if this value 1, is it an input or an output? Well, another word for y is output, so 1 is an output value. So I just want you to be able to recognize information when you see those equations. You already know what the graph should look like. You already know the slope, and then you should be able to tell if that value is an input or an output value. So now let's see if we can switch that. Let's see if they can give us information and we can then write the equation of the line, because we may be asked to do that on a quiz or a test. So let's look at the next example. I've got write the equation of the line that contains the point -6, 4 and has an undefined slope. So let's see what information they've given us. They've told us that we have an ordered pair and we have an undefined slope. So undefined U, that means we have a VUX equation. So I'm going to mark out HOI. Now I know that my graph line is vertical. It's going straight up and down. I know that my slope is undefined because of this little memory jogger. It's helping me out. And now I know that my equation has got to be x equals a number, and that number has to be an input value because input is another word for x. So now I want to write the equation of the line. So they're asking for this part for my answer, so I'm going to say x equals, and then I've got to figure out of this point, which number is the input value? Well, it'd be where the x coordinate is, and that is -6. So my equation for my vertical line is x equals -6. All right, let's look at the next one. Write the equation of the line that passes through the point 6, -6, and is perpendicular to the x-axis. Okay, so again, here's some information. They gave me a point. They told me I'm perpendicular to the x-axis, so I got to think about this. So I'm going to sketch out a little x-axis so I can have some little visual help. Okay, if it's perpendicular, that means it can't look like the x-axis, so it can't be horizontal. That means my graph line has to be vertical. And that's going to put me perpendicular to the x. So again, I have a vertical line. I don't have a horizontal graph line. I know my line is vertical, which now tells me information. I now know my slope without having to do any work. My slope is undefined. And I now know, because it's a VUX equation, I know how to write my equation. It's going to be x equals a number, and that number has to be an input value, because input is another word for x. So what did they ask me for? Which part of this information did they ask me for? They asked me for the equation of the line. So my final answer is going to be x equals an input value. I got to figure out what my input value is. Oh, there it is. It's either 6 or -6, and the input value is 6 because it's got to be in the place where the x coordinate is. So my equation for the vertical line that passes through the point 6, -6 is x equals 6. Final answer. This is what I would look for in a multiple choice quiz or test. Or this would be the answer that I would give if they were asking me to actually write the equation as the answer and there was no multiple choice. All right, let's look at this last one here. Write the equation of the line that passes through the point -6, 4 and has a slope of 0. Okay, they've given me some information here. I have a point and a slope of 0. Okay, if I'm 0, O is 0, so it's a Hoy line, it's not a VUX. Now I know the graph picture should look like a horizontal line. If I was matching it up to a graph, I know I better not pick anything but a picture that's horizontal. I also know my slope. They told me the slope was 0, but that O also helps me identify and connect with the number 0. And I also know how to write my equation. My equation is y. That's why the y is there in Hoy, to remember, help you know that the equation starts off y equals, and that number after the equal sign has to be an output value because output is another word for y. All right, so what are they asking me for? They're asking me for the graph, the slope, or the equation, and they're asking me for the equation. So my final answer is going to be y equals, and now I've got to find an output value. They gave me a point, and now I have to figure out which number is my output value. That's my y value, so it's 4. My equation of the line that passes through the point -6, 4 is the equation y equals 4. And finally, write the equation of the line that contains the point 2, 12 and is perpendicular to the y-axis. So again, they've given me a point. They've told me I'm perpendicular to the y-axis. So I need to sketch this out so I can visualize what's going on here. So I'm going to sketch a y-axis because that's up and down. Okay, if I'm perpendicular to that, that means I'm not going to be a vertical line because that would be parallel. So it has to be a horizontal graph line so that I can cross the y-axis at a 90 degree. So if I am horizontal, that means H, Hoy. So I am not a vertical line, I'm a horizontal graph line, which now tells me O connects me to 0. I now know my slope is 0. And I now know how to start writing my equation for the line. Y is cluing me into y equals, and that number is an output value. Because again, y and output are synonyms for the same thing. Output is another word for y. All right, so now I got to figure out what are they asking me for, the graph, the slope, or the equation. They are asking me for the equation, so my final answer is going to start y equals, and now I got to figure out which one of these is my output value. And that would be the 12. So my equation of the horizontal line, the line that is perpendicular to the y-axis and passes through the point 2, 12, is the equation for y equals 12. Okay, and now you know how to write the equations of lines when your slopes are 0 or undefined.